Check this out. It's good, isn't it? This might sound awful. It might look even worse. Just trying it out. Alright, so Stuart Turton. Stuart Turton wrote The Devil in the Dark Water. The Devil in the Dark Water was my favourite piece of genre fiction in 2020. I've made a video about it. It's a mystery novel set on a ship. It has this wonderful claustrophobic environment. It plays on tropes that were established by people like Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie. The Devil in the Dark Water is sinister, it's creepy, it's kind of monstrous in places, and it plays with all of these tropes and designs and things that we've come to understand about mystery novels. And it does so in a fun, supernatural and really engaging way. It's a long book, it's a thick book, and it's an absolutely beautiful book. It is my favourite book within any kind of genre fiction category of 2020. As soon as I finished reading it, I went out and found a gorgeous hardback copy of his first book, The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. As you can tell by my bookmark, I'm actually about 90% through it, but I'm here and I have this, so I'm filming it now. And so I actually don't know the very climax of this book at the time of filming. Now, The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle was Stuart Turton's first published novel. You know what debuts can be like. We all know how debuts can feel once we've read an author's later works. You look back and you see something that's raw, something that's maybe a bit rushed, something that didn't quite have that level of poeticism or polish or something that they found with time and experience, but they were lucky enough to get published in the first place. 7 Deaths doesn't have that. 7 Deaths is polished. 7 Deaths is beautiful. 7 Deaths is full of gorgeous language and wonderful characterization and character writing and dialogue all the way through it. And it enables itself to have this wonderfully beautiful descriptive language through some very clever narrative structure and storytelling techniques. This is a book that does the narrator as a character, as a medium, as a tool, differently than any other book that I have ever read. And in that sense, it's even more imaginative than The Devil in the Dark Water. But before we get there, let's go back a bit. I'm going to say up front that I'm not going to be spoiling anything about this book. If you haven't yet read 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, you can watch this. I'm not going to spoil anything beyond, I'd say, the first quarter of the book, and more is spoiled by the blurb than what I'm going to talk about. The only thing that I will say is that the blurb tells you things that happen after the first quarter, but going through the first quarter itself, feeling a little bit lost and confused and knowing by the blurb that it will all eventually make sense is kind of a journey and an adventure in and of itself, and that's pretty much what I'm going to talk about. But at the same time, I am not spoiling anything about this book in terms of the mystery or even where it goes. So I'm just going to really talk about what I noticed at the beginning and a little bit about my thoughts in terms of what happens later on, but not actually what happens. So rest easy. So, as the blurb states, The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle is set in a house called Blackheath. It is a countryside manor, somewhere in the English countryside. There is no fixed date, but based on the technology, based on a few lines spoken by the characters, you can assume it's somewhere within the first 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century. There are cars, but there are also horses and traps. There are maids and servants and butlers and valets and all the things that are no longer part of our ordinary life, but if you watch Downton Abbey, you know that they were part of our everyday life, for some people, around 1910, 1920, 1930. So somewhere around the First World War is where we are, but it's never explicit the date exactly. Not like The Devil in the Dark Water, which explicitly states it's the first part of the 17th century. Anyway, we got our setting. What happens? The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, as the title suggests, is about a woman dying several times. Our protagonist is an unknown person called Aidan. Aidan Bishop, all we know about him from the blurb is that he's a guest at Blackheath, and that there is a masquerade ball that will happen tonight. And Aidan has been tasked by some entity, some magic, some god, some power, with solving the murder of Evelyn Hardcastle. That murder will happen at 11 p.m. When he fails, and he will fail. He wakes up the next day in the body of a different guest. And there are 8 bodies that he inhabits throughout the course of the book, hence 7 deaths. And by the title, you can assume he must stop the 8th, because there are 8 people, 7 deaths. Now, it's like that Japanese proverb, fall down 7 times, get up 8 times. I wonder if that was on purpose. So, you have 8 protagonists, effectively. But also you don't, because Aidan Bishop is our protagonist, and he is the one who is inhabiting these other guests. But we don't know who Aidan is. We don't ever see his physical form, we only see him inside these other characters. So this is what I was talking about there being an interesting use of the narrator. Aidan has a personality, but he lives inside the bodies of these other guests, ranging from rich old men to enormous fat bankers to a young detective. They're all men. They are all very, very different people, and we do get to know their personalities. And as the book goes on, Aidan begins to realize that their personalities are kind of rubbing off on him. He's collecting their memories as he goes, and they feed into him, and it seems like he's losing himself. Is that a spoiler? I don't think it's a spoiler. So it's very interesting because our narrator is a person, but he's not a person we know. We know the people he inhabits way more. Interesting technique. So the blurb tells us that this man, Aidan Bishop, is going to inhabit these different bodies as he goes through the story in an attempt to solve the mystery of this murder of Evelyn Hardcastle. The Hardcastles are the family that own Blackheath Estate. They're the ones hosting the party, and their daughter, Evelyn, she's about 27. She spent almost her entire life living in Paris because when she was a child, she witnessed and was kind of blamed for not stopping the death and murder of her brother. When they were children, there was a party at Blackheath, and her brother was murdered at the edge of the lake. The murderer was caught. The murderer had an accomplice who ran away, and that accomplice, we don't know. But Evelyn was then sent to Paris. Her parents don't really like her, and now she's back, and they're hosting a party and bringing back the exact same people who were at that original party 19 years ago. So you start to think, okay, who could it be? Now, I can't speak for every mystery reader, and I'm actually a really new reader of mystery novels, but I don't care about whodunit. I care about what happens on the road to get to finding out whodunit. I will leave figuring out whodunit to the detective. It's not my job. And this book encourages that kind of thinking. More than anything else, The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle is an adventure. Whodunit is not too important. It's really how you get there and what you discover along the way. There's lots of twists and turns, lots of traps to fall into, and so it does feel like an adventure in a very claustrophobic environment, more than it does a figuring out who done it and why they done it, etc. Even though that is Aidan's purpose, that is Aidan's mission, it's not really ours as a reader. Ours is just to enjoy the ride, because the ride is so exciting. The philosophy behind it, or the morality of Aidan falling into these different personalities and trying to figure it all out is endlessly fascinating. What's very different about the blurb and the actual opening of the book is that the blurb tells you things that you don't actually find out when you read it until about like 130, 150 pages in is when you start to read things that the blurb has already told you. Up until that point, you feel really, really lost because the book begins initially with a man with memory loss who wakes up in a forest in the middle of a body, and that body is in the middle of walking and in the middle of talking. Can you imagine if you suddenly, I can't snap with my right hand, if you suddenly snapped into a body and a mind, you think it's yours. This man thinks he is himself, okay? So this man is a doctor. He doesn't know he's a doctor at this point. His name's Bell. And Bell suddenly screams, Anna. And you imagine you wake up. You've suddenly lost all your memory and you become alert in the middle of a word being screamed in the middle of a forest. That's what happens to him. He suddenly wakes up in that situation. All he knows is the word Anna that has just left his lips. That's it. And then he sees a woman being chased by a man, he hears a gunshot, and he assumes the man has killed the woman, and now he needs help. He failed to save her because he was frightened in the moment. He doesn't know who she is. He thinks she must be Anna, and he must have been in the middle of trying to save her and failed. Suddenly, someone comes along, presumably the person who was chasing and presumably then killed Anna, comes along behind him and slips something into his pocket and says into his ear, "Go east." When he checks his pocket, it's a compass with his own initials carved on it. Well, he finds out they're his initials later when he finds out who he is. So he goes east, and he he arrives at Blackheath. And when he gets there, people know who he is. And these people feel sorry. Oh, you lost your memory, mate. That's a shame. Let me tell you who you are. You're my friend, etc., etc. These are your initials on the compass. You say that someone died. We don't know who Anna is. No one in the house, all servants and guests, no one knows who Anna is. So they send a search party out to try and find her while Bell recovers in his room. And then 100 pages go by with him very, very confused about what's going on. Slowly, things become apparent, and the blurb of the book then makes sense. Really, we have a man called Aidan, who is in the body of Dr. Bell, and tomorrow he will be in a different body, and a different body, and a different body. Something the blurb doesn't tell you, and I'm going to tell you, and I do not consider it a spoiler, is that he does not... It's Groundhog Day, right? If I haven't made that clear, it is Groundhog Day. Every day he wakes up in the same day, in a different body, and he has to try again. From a different perspective, with different memories, a different point of view. And because these are different guests with different backgrounds, they all have different friends that they can talk to and different backgrounds and experiences that help them. You know, sometimes they're a servant, therefore they have access to certain areas. Sometimes they're a guest, therefore they have a certain amount of money and power and clout. But what the blurb doesn't tell you is that they all overlap. All of these people exist in one day. When Bell's day is over and Aidan falls into the personality and body of another person the next day, he doesn't then bump into Bell as ordinary Bell. He bumps into himself as Bell from yesterday. So every time he falls into a new personality, that person knows a little bit more than the last one did. And so as the book goes on, they do overlap and get to talk to each other. So very early on in the book, he meets people who are him in different bodies, who are just a few days older than him and know things that he doesn't. And they tell him little things that are going to happen. And this is where, as soon as this first happens, and it happens quite early on, as soon as this happens, you go, holy shit, the plotting and planning that went into this. Because a lot of people, a lot of authors, we call them discovery writers, people who have a general idea of what their book is and they just start. And they make it up as they go along. And then they edit it so that it all feels coherent. This is a very ordinary way of becoming a writer, an ordinary way of writing a book. Stuart Turton is not that. This is very, very clear from the beginning. I'm not sure a mystery writer even could be that. The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle makes constant reference to things that happen so far in the future, being told by people from a few days in the future to people in the past for specific reasons. This is a story that is so well stitched together. And this is by far the most impressive thing about this book, is that all the way through, everything has been so meticulously plotted out. I can only assume that Stuart Turton had this book plotted out over months and months and months of research and writing and plotting and planning before he actually wrote a word of the actual text. This must have been weeks, months of planning and meticulous design and detail. It is insane. There is a map, actually. There's a map of the house. This map doesn't do you that much good. It's nice to have. Helps paint a little bit of a picture. Helps you get your bearings a little bit, like a blueprint of the world that you're in. And you are only in this house, this big manor. It's very claustrophobic. But it's a fantasy. This feels like an entire fantasy journey that takes place in a single house. So it never feels bland or constrained, even though it certainly feels claustrophobic. But it's the time manipulation. More than world building and geography like in a fantasy novel, it's about time. He has plotted and planned the timeline of this so meticulously, I can't even imagine how he did it. To not have a single piece go astray. He had this puzzle, a 1,000-piece puzzle, all put together perfectly. He knew everything, every thread that stitched every piece together absolutely perfectly before he even put pen to paper. I don't know this for a fact, but I don't know how else he could have done it, unless he just kept going back and editing things in over and over again, which would have been a real headache. I would hate that. So it's this plotting and planning that is so intensely impressive. And the other thing that I don't know for a fact, but as a big gamer, TM, I don't know how this couldn't be possible. I find it interesting. I don't know. Stuart Turton actually follows me on Twitter, which is just the loveliest thing. So maybe I'll ask him. I can't help but wonder if this book and his second book were inspired by very specific video games. As far as I can figure out, this book came out about a year after a video game came out called Sexy Brutale. Sexy Brutale is an indie game that is pretty much this book, at least in terms of its gimmick of falling into different personalities within the space of a single building while trying to solve or prevent murders, and switching from character to character, guest to guest, servant to servant. Same thing. Sexy Brutale came out, and then this book came out. Then, before The Devil in the Dark Water came out, we had another indie game called The Return of the Obra Dinn. I mentioned that in my video when I talked about The Devil in the Dark Water, but The Return of the Obra Dinn is a detective game set on a ship where you have to slowly solve the death and murder and events of the story of a ship called the Obra Dinn, where every single person on the ship died in a single voyage. And you figure out how they died, and it kind of comes in chapters, and you're a detective, you're on the ship, and you rebuild the murders as you go and figure out who did it. And it's amazing to think, Sexy Brutale came out, then this came out, then Obra Dinn came out, then The Devil in the Dark Water. And I have a feeling, I love the idea that Stuart Turton is a big gamer who plays these little indie games and just takes that central conceit and goes, how could I create a story out of something like this? Because it just seems to work really well. This is not an accusatory thing. I am not saying that anything here that Stuart Turton does is derivative. I am nothing but a wonderful, big, huge fan of his. I love his mind, I love his creativity. I just like to think that these games, which I also love, were big influences on him. That he played these games and went, now this would make a good book. And there we are. And he did it twice. And I guess we'll see what happens if there's a third one that comes after an indie game that I play and I think, ooh, maybe his third game will be about a trans girl climbing a mountain. That's it, really. Writing style, actually I haven't talked enough about how good this is. Quite often when you read the first few chapters of a book, there's a lot of really beautiful poetic language. This isn't sweat, by the way. I got rained on the way here and I decided to just start filming, if I mention that. Which is also why the lens keeps fogging up, because I went from cold rain to hot room. No one cares. Anyway, quite often you read a book and the first few chapters are particularly beautifully poetic, and then that poetic language kind of starts to fall away as the book goes on, because maybe the writer, as well as the reader, is even more interested in just the plot and the dialogue and what's going on, because it speeds up and you get more and more intensely invested in it. But at the beginning you've got this setting the scene that usually uses really beautiful language. Not Stuart Turton. His language is consistently beautiful and creative all the way through. His metaphors, his playful descriptions, his wit is present from page one, from word one to the end, or at least to 90% through, which is where I am. But it's gorgeous, gorgeous language. The way he describes people is absolutely fantastic. There's a bit where he inhabits the body of an enormous banker. And this guy is not just fat, I mean, he's impossibly large. And there's a bit where he's in the body of this character and he tries to turn around to talk to someone behind him. He's sitting down and they're stood behind him and he wants to just swivel around. But he says, I tried to turn around, but there was too much banker in the way. I just thought it was beautiful, playful, funny, made me laugh immediately. He does this constantly, especially when he describes his characters that Aidan embodies, because Aidan has opinions about the bodies he's now trapped in. Whether they're old and frail, or fat and can't get up the stairs, and he really has fun describing them. It's a little bit fattest, I guess, but as someone who's always been chubby, I've never had a problem with that so much. I'm just going to read like the last few lines of chapter 1, just so you can see how beautiful it is. This guy's failed to save this woman, and now he's got this compass, and it was given to him by the guy who killed the woman, he assumes, and he's got to try and get somewhere. And this is what he says. How lost do you have to be to let the devil lead you home? This lost, I decide. Precisely this lost. Easing myself off the tree, I lay the compass flat in my palm. It yearns for north, so I point myself east, against the wind and the cold, against the world itself. Hope has deserted me. I am a man in purgatory, blind to the sins that chased me here. Fantastic. That kind of writing does not let up until the end. It is gorgeous all the way through. He finds several moments throughout the book for Aidan and his host to almost argue with each other and describe each other and have a battle of wits. It's just incredibly inventive. The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle is a celebration of writing. It's a celebration of its influences, possibly indie games, more likely just wonderful mystery novels, Agatha Christie. He understands claustrophobia. He understands that these stories, this is based on 2 novels of his now. He understands that these novels are best told in claustrophobic, frightening environments where people feel closed in. He makes incredible use of the space because he knows he only has a ship or a house in which to explain all of his events, to tell his story, to place his characters, to create relationships between them. He does the best with that space. He does an incredible job with making use of every single moment, every single corner of every room, meticulously planned out. It's really incredible stuff. And Stuart Turton is a master plotter. As I've already said, he must have been plotting this for months. And he's incredibly gifted at writing his characters and what they have to say and think. There is not a character in this that doesn't have a fantastic personality, and most of those personalities Aidan gets to embody and inject with his own personality. It blends these people incredibly well together, like batter. It's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic character writing and relationship writing and sewing together of these disparate ideas and plots and events. I cannot get over how well written and designed this story and its characters and its events are. The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle and The Devil in the Dark Water are perfect mystery novels. I'm in a position where I kind of think, okay, I've read these, I want more that are exactly this. But these are exactly what I've been looking for. When I think about great mystery novels, these are the books that I wanted. And I got them. So get them.